Imagine driving down a secluded highway, the kind where the ancient trees lean in so close they almost touch your windshield. It's raining heavily, the asphalt is slick, and visibility is practically zero. This was the exact setting on the night of November 14th, when Arthur Vance, a well-respected local architect, supposedly lost control of his SUV and plummeted down a steep, unforgiving ravine. When the local authorities arrived the next morning, they took one look at the mangled wreckage, the lack of skid marks, and quickly stamped the case as a tragic open-and-shut accident. The preliminary theory suggested he hit a patch of black ice, panicked, overcorrected, and went over the edge. His friends and family mourned. The community held a solemn vigil, and everyone prepared to move on with their lives. But here's the thing about open-and-shut cases. They rarely stay closed when you actually look closely at the paperwork. You see, a few weeks after the funeral, a routine filing crossed the desk of a junior claims adjuster at a massive insurance firm in another state. And the strangest part is, this adjuster wasn't even looking for a crime. He was just doing his daily mindless data entry when he noticed a glaring anomaly in Arthur's file. Nobody in Arthur's family knew about this document, and his own fiercely loyal lawyer was completely in the dark. It was a life insurance policy, but not the standard kind you or I might get to protect our loved ones and pay off a mortgage. This was something entirely different, something so incredibly specific and deeply unsettling that it made the claims adjuster physically freeze in his chair. Arthur was known as a careful man, someone who double-checked every blueprint and receipt. Yet just 72 hours before his car careened off that cliff, he had walked into a small, out-of-town brokerage and made a massive alteration to his existing coverage. He didn't just increase the payout to leave more behind. He added a highly unusual, almost unheard-of death rider. In the insurance world, a rider is just an extra provision, usually for things like accidental dismemberment or terminal illness. But Arthur's new clause stated that the payout would instantly quadruple to a staggering $10 million if, and only if, he died in a single-vehicle car crash on a rural road between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. Let that sink in for a second. What kind of person predicts the exact bizarre circumstances of their own fatal accident just 3 days before it happens? When the local police were finally tipped off about this, they completely dismissed it at first, chalking it up to a morbid freak coincidence. But coincidences don't usually come with a $10 million price tag attached, do they? Now, you might be thinking that maybe Arthur was just incredibly paranoid, or had some sort of weird, dark premonition. But the deeper investigators dug into this policy, the darker the whole picture became. The signature on the bottom of the amended contract was definitely his. The forensic handwriting experts confirmed that much without a shadow of a doubt. But there was a tiny detail that almost everyone missed during the initial review: the ink. The pen used to sign that document wasn't the standard blue or black ballpoint you find chained to a desk at a typical brokerage firm. It was signed with a very specific, rare type of drafting pen, the exact kind Arthur used exclusively in his architectural studio. This meant he didn't just walk in on a whim and sign a piece of paper they handed him. He brought his own pen, meaning he likely reviewed and prepared for this moment meticulously over several days. And here is where it all gets really strange. The beneficiary of this new $10 million clause wasn't his loving wife, nor was it his 2 children, or even the charitable foundation he had spent years building from the ground up. The money was directed entirely to a newly formed, highly anonymous offshore trust, registered in the Cayman Islands. A trust that had been incorporated literally the morning of the day he signed the insurance amendment. To set up an entity like that requires serious capital, complex legal gymnastics, and a level of secrecy that completely contradicts the life of a seemingly boring suburban architect. The local detective, a weathered guy named Miller, who had initially brushed off the case, finally decided to pull Arthur's financial records from the last 6 months to see if he was hiding debt. What he found instead made the hair on the back of his neck stand straight up. Arthur had been quietly liquidating every single one of his assets. He sold his beloved vintage car collection for cash. He secretly remortgaged his summer cabin, and he emptied out his personal savings account, leaving only enough to cover the basic monthly utility bills. He was pooling cash, almost $2 million of it, and every single cent had completely vanished into thin air. No wire transfers to track, no bank drafts to follow, just massive, untraceable cash withdrawals made week after week. It was as if Arthur was preparing to vanish entirely, or perhaps paying off someone who had backed him into a terrifying, inescapable corner. The insurance agent who processed the rider finally spoke up and remembered Arthur coming into the office that fateful day. He said Arthur looked utterly exhausted, like he hadn't slept a wink in weeks. He kept anxiously checking his watch and glancing out the front window at a dark sedan parked idling across the street. The agent assumed Arthur was just in a rush to get back to work, but looking back, he realized the man was absolutely terrified. He was sweating profusely. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold that custom drafting pen, and he kept muttering under his breath that he had to get the paperwork finalized before the weekend arrived. He was a man clearly running out of time, making one final desperate play for his life. This is where the story shifts entirely from a suspicious death into a full-blown, terrifying conspiracy. Detective Miller realized that Arthur didn't just casually predict his own death. He engineered a massive financial tripwire. But why would someone do that? If you are being threatened, you go to the police, you hire private security, you lock your doors. You certainly don't bet $10 million on your own murder. Unless, of course, the people threatening you are so powerful or so deeply embedded in your everyday life that you have absolutely nowhere left to run. Miller started looking incredibly closely at the people in Arthur's inner circle, starting with his longtime business partner, David. David was a smooth talker, the charismatic face of their architectural firm, while Arthur was the quiet brains behind the brilliant blueprints. The firm had recently won a massive, highly controversial bid to design a new commercial complex on the very edge of town, a sprawling project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But digging deep into the firm's private, encrypted emails, Miller found out that the entire project was a complete facade. It was bleeding money daily, tied up in shady zoning payouts, and relying entirely on funding from some very dangerous, anonymous investors with heavy ties to organized crime. David had essentially sold the soul of their company to keep them afloat, and Arthur had only just found out the horrifying truth. The hidden emails showed a huge, explosive falling out between the two men just weeks before the fatal crash. Arthur wanted to blow the whistle, to take all the damning evidence straight to the feds and wash his hands of the whole dirty operation before he was implicated. David had aggressively begged him to stay quiet, explicitly warning him that the people they were in bed with didn't just fire whistleblowers, they erased them permanently. Suddenly, the bizarre insurance policy started to make a twisted, brilliant kind of sense. Arthur knew with absolute certainty he was a dead man walking. He knew these ruthless investors were going to silence him, and he knew they would try to make it look like a tragic, everyday accident to avoid drawing any police heat to their illegal construction project. So, what did Arthur do? He couldn't stop the hitmen, but he could absolutely make sure they didn't get away with it. By attaching that hyper-specific rider to his life insurance, Arthur guaranteed that his death would be heavily scrutinized by corporate lawyers and aggressive fraud investigators. People with way more resources and motivation than the small local police department. He basically painted a giant neon red bullseye on his own so-called accident. He was deliberately leaving a breadcrumb trail from beyond the grave, forcing the authorities to look past the shattered glass and the black ice and see the cold-blooded murder that was actually taking place. But the offshore trust was still the most glaring missing puzzle piece. Who on earth was going to collect the $10 million if everyone was guilty? The breakthrough finally came from a completely unexpected, entirely relentless source. The insurance company, absolutely desperate to avoid paying out $10 million on a highly suspicious claim, had hired a ruthless private investigator named Sarah Vance. No relation to Arthur, just a remarkably sharp-eyed ex-detective who lived for finding tiny legal loopholes. Sarah didn't care about the local mob dynamics or the shady construction deal. She just blindly followed the money trail. Using some highly questionable tactics, she managed to trace the encrypted IP address used to set up that Cayman Islands trust. and the location it pinged back to wasn't David's downtown office, and it certainly wasn't the shadowy headquarters of some dangerous crime syndicate. It pinged back directly to a laptop sitting quietly inside Arthur's own home. More specifically, a personal laptop belonging to his grieving wife, Helen. Helen had played the role of the devastated, heartbroken widow absolutely perfectly from day one. She cried openly at the press conferences. She leaned heavily on David for emotional support during the funeral, and she had the entire town completely wrapped around her finger, pitying the poor mother who lost her husband to a cruel twist of fate. But Sarah's brutal cyber forensics told a wildly different, deeply sinister story. Helen wasn't just vaguely aware of the mob ties. She was the one who originally introduced David to the shady investors in the first place. She had been carrying on a passionate secret affair with David for over 3 years, right under Arthur's nose. The two of them had orchestrated the entire construction scam together, using Arthur's pristine reputation as a brilliant shield to deflect any regulatory suspicion. When Arthur discovered the massive fraud and threatened to go to the authorities, Helen realized she was about to lose everything in one fell swoop: her wealthy lover, her lavish lifestyle, and her freedom. They couldn't just casually divorce him. Arthur had the hard evidence to send them both to a federal prison for decades. So, they decided together that he had to have a terrible accident. But Arthur was way smarter and far more observant than they ever realized. He had discovered the affair and the bitter betrayal months earlier. Instead of confronting her in a rage, he played along beautifully while quietly setting his final, inescapable trap. That $2 million in cash he had liquidated so quickly, he didn't lose it. He hid it masterfully. He used it to secretly hire an untouchable offshore law firm to create the trust, not to hide the money for Helen, but to completely freeze the payout. The trust was legally structured, so that the $10 million would only ever be released if someone was formally convicted of his murder. If it remained an unproven accident, the money sat in permanent limbo forever. He named Helen as the primary beneficiary, knowing her endless greed would completely blind her to the danger. He knew she and David would aggressively try to claim the massive payout, and to do so, they would have to willingly expose themselves to the intense, microscopic scrutiny of a corporate fraud investigation. Arthur essentially weaponized his own life insurance policy against the very woman who was actively planning to kill him. The final, devastating trap was officially sprung when Helen, completely unaware of the lethal poison pill hidden deep inside the trust's complex bylaws, formally applied to claim the $10 million. To satisfy the insurance company's incredibly rigid legal requirements for a payout of that size, she had to submit a sworn deposition detailing her exact whereabouts on the night of the crash and willingly hand over her personal electronic devices for what she was told was a routine fraud sweep. It was supposed to be a simple formality, but she walked proudly and blindly right into the snare Arthur had left waiting for her. When Sarah, the relentless insurance investigator, imaged Helen's phone, she easily bypassed the basic security and found a hidden folder containing deleted encrypted messages between Helen and a local shady mechanic. The chilling messages detailed an upfront payment of $50,000 to intentionally tamper with the brake lines and the steering column of Arthur's SUV on the exact night of the heavy storm. They had specifically chosen that dangerous rural road because they knew his exact route home from the architectural studio. It was never black ice. It was a perfectly timed, remote-controlled mechanical failure designed to look like a tragedy. Armed with this undeniable, rock-solid proof, Detective Miller didn't hesitate for a single second. Heavily armed police raided Helen's luxurious home at dawn, dragging her out onto the lawn in handcuffs while the local news cameras flashed endlessly. David was picked up at his fancy office a few hours later, his smug face turning chalk white, as he realized their perfect foolproof crime had unraveled entirely. The mechanic rolled over on them almost immediately in exchange for a generous plea deal, and the entire corrupt construction project collapsed overnight, taking the dangerous mob investors down with it in a massive federal sweep. Arthur ultimately lost his life, but he definitively won the war. He knew he couldn't possibly survive the powerful people closing in on him, so he used the only thing he had left, his own inevitable violent death, to serve justice absolutely cold. That $10 million insurance policy was never actually about the money for a single second. It was an elaborate, flawlessly designed mechanism to intentionally trigger a massive financial and criminal investigation that local cops would never have the budget or the initial suspicion to launch on their own. He literally bought his own justice with an insurance premium. And as the heavy prison doors slammed shut on Helen and David for the rest of their natural lives, you have to wonder about the sheer, unimaginable willpower it takes to walk into a mundane office, sign a document accurately predicting your own violent murder, and then drive out into the dark, rainy night, knowing exactly what is waiting for you in the shadows. It makes you look at every tragic accident on the evening news just a little bit differently, doesn't it? Because sometimes the dead speak the absolute loudest through the quiet paperwork they leave behind.